Hello again, I'm Barry James and I'm delighted to be here for this next episode in the COVID Spring series when we look at the kind of world we are building, the kind of world we need, the kind of world we should be building post-COVID, the new normal. And I'm delighted to be with Professor Ronald MacDonald from Glasgow University, who has written both a report and a follow-up about post-pandemic, what should the new normal be, looking at the choices and saying this time it's got to be different. So firstly, thank you for writing this report. It's excitingly insightful from my point of view. But first of all, Professor MacDonald, welcome.
Well, thank you, Barry, and thanks very much for the introduction and your comments on the paper, which are very welcome. Okay,
so would you just, before we begin, just tell us a little bit about your background a little bit and how you come to this subject matter. I know you've got a long history, but if you could just sort of give us a quick summary and then how you came to write the report.
Yes. Well, I'm a professional economist, obviously. My main area of interest is in fact a little different to the main topic of the papers, and it is international finance. I've done a lot of work in international finance, particularly currency economics, exchange rate determination, and so on. That was the mainstay of my academic career, and did a lot of consultancy on these issues for various public organizations and private organizations. As you get older as an economist, you start to become more interested in policy issues. And in my time at Glasgow University, I've been the Adam Smith Professor of Political Economy, which is a return to a more traditional form of economics, which is a much more policy-oriented focus. And so over time, since I held that chair, I've become more interested in public policy issues, which is what led me to write the two papers about what the post-pandemic economy would and should look like. And both of these papers, just to give a plug to Glasgow University, were published by Policy Scotland, which is a think tank, a policy think tank within Glasgow University. So if people are interested in following up on any of the topics we're going to discuss today, the papers can be downloaded from Policy Scotland's website.
Great. Well, we'll try and attach the URL for that to this at the end.
Yeah.
So, as we kind of, it's difficult to characterize the report because there's a lot there.
Yeah.
In summary, it's a pretty radical, by some lights anyway, look at how we create a new kind of economics and a new kind of social contract with values. And one of the things that's right at the front of that is that the need to move from the shareholder capitalism model based on short-termism and value extraction to a stakeholder model based on value creation. Could you unwrap that a little bit for those who are not necessarily familiar with some of the terminology, but also, is this a mainstream view for economists now, or is that not yet?
Okay, yeah. Well, yes. The stakeholder model that I discuss in the paper, this came out of, there's obviously a lot of discussion about stakeholder capitalism at the moment. I mean, it was one of the main themes at this year's Davos Economic Forum. There's, I think, 100 CEOs of some of US's leading corporations have signed up to stakeholder capitalism. So I think there's big momentum in the business and public policy arena for a move away from so-called shareholder capitalism. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Whether there is the same appetite in academia, amongst academia economists, I'm not so sure about that. I haven't seen so much being written on the topic there. But I think definitely there is an appetite for a move away from the kind of paradigm we've had over the last, what is it now, be 40 years since basically since the 1980s. We've had a considerable focus on finance in the UK and also in the US. And of course, it's no bad thing to have a financial sector, but which is an important driver of the economy. But I think in the UK and in the US, it became the dominant sector, and it crowded out manufacturing. And for a long time, until the financial crisis, politicians, policymakers thought there was no problem there. That shift to finance was a good thing. But I think the financial crisis indicated that model of what is shareholder capitalism, where the shareholder is the dominant voice or the dominant objective, if you like, in the firm, was not a good was not a good model. It was a kind of dead end, if you like. And the reason for that is as you mentioned, it did lead to short-termism in terms of investment, and I think that's been a very crucial failure in the UK economy. That the banking sector and finance more generally, if you think of asset management, have been very much focused on value extraction. That is, I guess, generally speaking, rent seeking rather than value creation. And I think that's been detrimental to the UK economy. It's meant that the large pool of savings that we've seen in the post-war period has not really been channeled into long-term productive investment in the way it has in other countries, where they've had a more balanced stakeholder type of model, where it's not just the shareholder that's important, it's the employees, obviously, distributors, suppliers of the company, and also more generally the broader community. And so it seems that in countries where you have a form of stakeholder capitalism, and Germany, I think, is a good example of that, these economies seem to be much more resilient, certainly in the face of, for example, the pandemic. And so I think I do think we need to rethink the kind of underlying ethos that we've had in the UK and indeed of course in the US as well. There's similar problems there. And I think one of the problems in the UK certainly has been, and I bring this out in the paper, that there's been a big depreciation of what I call social capital. That is, there's been the move to individualism in our societies has meant that we don't see the same civic engagement that we saw in the past, and we don't see the same kind of social networks that we've had in the past, which build trust in societies and help societies to work more effectively and efficiently. And I think the pandemic has indicated that, by the communitarian type of and civic engagements we saw, certainly in the lockdown, where I think it was 100,000 people in the UK were involved in community efforts to rebuild after as the pandemic was developing. I think that suggests that people are maybe starting to rethink and reprioritize in their own minds what kind of society we want, and I think that's a good thing. I think the big question, of course, is can that be sustained going forward? And can policymakers maybe take advantage of that kind of civic engagement we've seen to build a fairer model going forward, rather than a model which seems to have created and perpetuated inequalities in our society?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the inequality issue, which is a big one, isn't it? There's a really interesting book I discovered recently entitled "Runaway Inequality." The thesis being that there's been an assumption it would rebalance, but there's still no sign of that happening, and we seem to have, the need for a collective noun for crises now. We seem to have a plague or a calamity of crises with climate change and with runaway inequality, underinvestment, going in we knew we were going to have a pandemic and didn't really invest effectively in that, and so on. Um, I, I, I mention those things because uh, it's natural to wonder whether there's some kind of there's a common root to those in terms of the short-termism and value extraction that we've seen as the norm.
Yeah, I think there is. I think you made a number of very good points there. I think the core element in what you're saying there is, I think we've not focused on sustainable development, and sustainable development is development where we recognise that we should have a broader objective than simply generating higher and higher GDP growth. We should be thinking of the next generation and what their needs are. We should be looking at inequality, because obviously, if that's left unaddressed, it can lead to all kind of civil problems in our societies, and many commentators think that that is a very worrying potential development going forward, because the pandemic seems to have exacerbated inequalities, particularly between the young and the old. I think that's very clear. And I think also in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we've had the creation of the so-called gig economy, with very insecure jobs, jobs which aren't particularly well paid. And that is another inequality which I think that the pandemic is highlighting. And I think you're right to say that the pandemic could have been predicted, because while we know there's an important government report which did indeed predict something like this, but again, because of the non-sustainable development that practically all developed countries have pursued, we've had the huge environmental consequences of that, the consequences for climate change. But of course, most people now accept, I think, that the humankind's voracious appetite for increased agricultural land, for example, deforestation, has created a greater likelihood of these so-called zootonic crossovers, where we can get these pathogens crossing over from the animal world to humans. And we've seen these increasing over time. There have been many recent examples, SARS, for example, HIV, and now the pandemic. So it was predictable. And again, as you refer to, we certainly in the UK, we did not have the necessary resilience, certainly in the public sector, but also I think in the private sector, to deal with the pandemic. And in large measure, I think that's a reflection of the austerity policies that were pursued post the financial crisis, which again, it's a kind of very complex mix, which again created the inequalities that we're referring to. So I think in going forward, we really have to recognize that the pandemic was predictable. We have to think about how we're going to build resilience. And I think certainly in the public sector, that will be an important element in addressing mass unemployment, which could still occur as we go forward, because despite all the good news about vaccines recently, there's still so much uncertainty about how the virus is going to develop. It may mutate, of course. And as we said, there's uncertainty about whether this is the first and last of these kind of pandemics. There could be more in the future. So I think building public sector resilience in health and social care, for example, is going to be very important, and a very important way of potentially addressing inequalities and mass unemployment. But going forward, I think that the central theme has got to be a broadly based measure of development which is sustainable and recognises inequality, environmental issues, the green agenda, and so on.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of bring forward and talk a little bit in a moment or two about looking forward into the COVID winter, because it's going to be tough. There's no two ways about it. We've, I guess, only seen the beginnings of the economic effects and the impacts that will have. And of course, this is the COVID Spring series, when we want to kind of look beyond that and about what we should be doing, both about that and what comes next. But before we kind of leave the territory that we were in. Part of what was in my mind was famously, I'm not as big as fan, but Bill Gates is on record of having talked about the need to invest in pandemic measures in very, very good time. And that was kind of ignored, and perhaps in an age of austerity, that was a big mistake. But the other thing I just wanted to ask you about was a couple of other economists who you may know them personally, for all I know. All economists all live in the same area, right? And all go to tea together. But Marianne Mazzucato at UCL, and her book on makers and takers in the global economy is something that has been an eye-opener for me in confirming much of what perhaps we've expected. What we've kind of seen with our own eyes as well. And also Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics.
Oh yes.
Are those things that relate to your work in any way and your report?
Well, I actually haven't read either of these books. I've read some related books by these authors, which bring out, I think, some of the points that I made about rent seeking and value extraction. So in that sense, I think there is a commonality in terms of what I'm saying here. Yeah. So I think that the kind of agenda that these authors have expressed in these books would be very similar to what I'm arguing in my papers. Yeah,
I can see there's certainly common themes and common calls as well to a balance rather than maximization. And away from something else I was on my list to ask you about was GDP, why it's so bad for us, and what we should do about it.
Well, I'm keen to emphasize that we shouldn't throw away GDP. I think there's
as a measure. I mean, of course.
Yeah, as a measure. In and of itself, it's a useful measure. But I think, as I argued in at least one of the papers, certainly initially in the lockdown, we've seen that people have prioritized health and well-being, and there's been a lot of survey evidence, I think, since the lockdown to suggest that people would like to place more emphasis on that going forward. So I think we should be looking at a more holistic measure of a society's well-being, and the metric shouldn't just be GDP growth as it has been in the past. And of course, governments all over the world are moving in that direction. New Zealand's a very good example. Scotland has moved in that direction as well. But obviously, I don't think it can be a binary thing, in the sense that if you move to exclusively thinking about well-being and then neglect GDP growth, well, you've got to ask, well, how are you going to pay for your public services going forward? So I would think of it as a measure which we kind of balance the GDP growth, which has to be sustainable GDP growth, as we were saying a few minutes ago, with a broader measure of how happy people are. And of course, that will be a function of a large number of things, including inequality, which we mentioned earlier, ability to be in a fresh and safe environment, having a job, having housing, and so on. So there's got to be a balance there, I think. I think in the past we've focused too much on GDP growth, and I think what the pandemic's saying is we need a better balance for our kind of metric of people's overall well-being going forward.
Yeah, because you get what you measure, I guess.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So I think number one on the list that came out in that great article summarising the report was we need a new social contract, and I think a lot of people have been feeling that for some time.
Yeah.
Could you just talk us through that? obviously we're faced with this COVID winter. You've already alluded to, I mean, government figures talk about up to 4 million unemployed.
Yeah.
And there's a reasonable presumption that may be conservative.
Yes.
There's one of our concerns, one of our initiatives is looking at evictions and repossessions, which measures are in place right now but can't be renewed indefinitely. So we think we need a whole new look, and very quickly, at the way that whole mechanism works. That's by the way. But, you know, what should we be looking for in a new social contract? How should that work? You know, both in the next phase of through the COVID winter out the other side, and in what we, I guess, call the COVID spring.
Yeah, well, the way I went about it, I mean, I was thinking of the social contract in terms of both the public sector and the private sector, and the private sector bit, I think, is about you know, a different kind of capitalism, if you like. As we discussed earlier, a move to shareholder capitalism. I think that part is very important. I think also, you know, we need to think of building resilience in the private sector as well as the public sector. I'll come to that in a moment, because we saw during the crisis that the prevailing model that we had of, certainly of manufacturing, was one in which we relied heavily on supply chains. I think about 80% of world trade's actually in so-called intermediate products. These are supply chain products and just-in-time delivery. Now, that model's all very well if the global economy is working smoothly, but if you get something like a pandemic or a war more dramatically, then these supply chains break down, obviously. And so in the private sector, I think we're going to see a move towards probably more localized supply and manufacture. But I think also importantly on the public sector, we've seen a lack of resilience, as we said earlier, in terms of a response to the pandemic, in terms of the ability of the NHS to cope with the crisis. And of course, one of the big issues there is that because we have had such severe public service cuts, you know, people who have got other illnesses and diseases are not being treated. So really, we need to build a system, I think, going forward, which has capacity not only to deal with unexpected pandemic shocks, but also the regular illnesses that people have. And that's one of the big issues, I think, that's going to come out of the pandemic going forward. And so what I did in my second paper was to say, well, if we think of the public sector social contract and the post-war period being defined by Beveridge, he listed the 5 giant scourges in the time he was writing in the 1940s, and they were, I think I've got them here, my memory is never very good, but they were idleness, which translates into unemployment today, disease. Well, we can think of that in terms of health, including public health, obviously, and social care. He also mentioned ignorance. Well, again, we can recast that into today's terms, in terms of education and the need for changing skills, because and we can maybe come back to this, we've seen the dramatic escalation of the adoption of new technologies, for example, which requires changes in skills. Squalor was something he mentioned. Well, that again could be recast in terms of housing and the environment. I think some work you've done yourself shows that you know, a lot of people are struggling to pay the rents during the crisis. Probably there's going to be a lot of people without houses at the end of this, and so there may be and probably will be a large need for more social housing, which may be one of the ways out of the pandemic. And his other scourge of the time was want, and so we still obviously have poverty and inequality today. So you can quite easily, I think of a new social contract which recasts the Beveridge report into today's terms. And when you do that, you can think about how we could rebuild the economy going forward. Now, obviously, that's very much in terms of the public sector, but we obviously need to think about how we grow the economy as well to generate the tax revenues to pay for all of that. That is clearly going to be important as well. But I think that's how I would think of the new social contract. It's got an important public sector element, which could obviously help to address mass unemployment that you refer to. And it's got an important private sector component as well in terms of recasting our model of capitalism, I think. But one of the biggies for me, I think, is, and this probably leads into a separate topic, but one of the biggies is that I think investment in what we could loosely call the green economy, I think, is a very important element in the way forward for the new spring, if you like, or the post-normal economy.
Yeah, one of the things that you've written about is the that we should not be returning to austerity policies, but you used also the term or a phrase about instigating a well-being fiscal stimulus, and one of the shockingly striking features of where we are right now and what we've seen over the last 8 months or so is a rising tide of insecurity, and with it, obviously, a rising tide in mental health issues. That is largely unaddressed. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that and how those things might actually be addressed and work together.
Yeah, I think there's growing evidence to suggest that a clean fiscal stimulus or a green fiscal stimulus will have much bigger bang for buck, if I can put it that way, than a traditional fiscal stimulus. Because I think the starting point of the thinking there is that we had the financial crisis, and there was a desire to return to the old order, which in a sense we did. Of course, austerity meant the old order was different, particularly in terms of public services. But the return to normality was one in which we basically very quickly reinforced the kind of carbon economy that we were in before. And this time, I think it's got to be different. And I think there is a greater recognition amongst politicians that we have to recognise that. And so I think there's a lot of evidence that if we invest in clean infrastructure, for example, that will have a much bigger so-called multiplier effect on the economy, and it will also have a bigger effect on climate change. You can think of things like the huge development of offshore wind farms, which are clearly very important in Scotland and also the north of England. And I think one of the issues there, which I should have maybe mentioned earlier when we were talking about the public sector, I think we need to think about procurement policies going forward, because certainly in a Scottish context, as you'll know, a lot of the actual infrastructure has been built overseas, and jobs have been lost. But also in a very rapidly changing technological world, it's important, I think, that countries such as the UK, Scotland, part of the UK, that we're able to be ahead of the curve in terms of our adoption of technology, that we're not just taking our technology from other countries, that we're actually investing in R&D to be ahead of the game and to be at the cutting edge of the new green technology. And so I think rather than I think the crisis, as we said earlier, has indicated the fragility of international supply chains. So I think when we're thinking about procuring, say, a new wind farm or the newer technology in wind farms, we should think about perhaps developing that in this country, because although it may be more costly initially to do it, I would argue maybe the external effects on other companies who are not necessarily directly in the creation of say a wind farm structure would potentially be very, very considerable, and could potentially be a very important way out of the out of mass unemployment. So I think we've got to rethink procurement crucially going forward, certainly in terms of what we're doing about investment in clean infrastructure. I think also investment in natural capital, you know, the environment around us, the water, the sea, the oceans, the geology, the ecosystems that we have. I think this is all going to be very important as well. And indeed, one of the leading banks, HSBC, I think has got a very important initiative in terms of showing the investment opportunities that there are going to be in taking care, if you like, of our natural assets going forward. So I think that is closely related to the kind of public resilience and the investment in green infrastructure.
Yeah, so this is kind of just more than economics as we know it, really, isn't it? It's a much broader vision and dare I say, even a relook at the operative values that have underpinned economics as we've known it.
I think it is, yeah. I think it's, you know, I think just as the financial crisis was a wake-up call for economists in terms of, you know, we probably called that wrong, and you know, a lot of people completely redesigning macroeconomics now as a result of that, which is closely related to what we're saying here. Yeah, we have to think. We have to think out of the box now, and we can't return to standard fiscal policies, if you like, because they will basically not be environmentally friendly policies. So we've got to rethink all of that in a big way, and it's going to be interesting to see how policy develops as a result of the pandemic, I think, because we have seen politicians in Europe, in the UK, calling for a clean fiscal stimulus, and it's just going to be interesting to see what form that takes going forward. Whether it will be sufficient to address the very real problems that we've been discussing.
Yeah, and you sort of touched on banking reform or rethinking.
Yes,
banking there. You know, in the last few days, just as we're doing this interview, it's become clear that at least three banks, the co-op known as for its ethical stance, Sainsbury's and TSB, effectively in talks for reasons we aren't told, but probably can reasonably well guess at this point in this particular scenario. Meanwhile, it's clear that China's testing its central bank digital currency, the digital yuan. The Bank of England has made it clear that things are going to change. It's pretty clear that it's a matter of time before we have, I guess, the digital pound. And that, does that obsolete the banking industry, as some people think? Do they need to find a new job or a new role? What do you think?
Well, I certainly think the application of all of these new digital technologies is extremely exciting, and it's certainly something that we need to engage in this country. And as I said earlier, be at the cutting edge, I think, of it. I'm unclear that it's. I mean, I can see it from an efficiency point of view, replacing certain important elements of the banking system. Certainly, obviously, in terms of transactions, we could see huge efficiency gains there in terms of digital currencies and central bank digital currencies. But the issue that I'm concerned about in terms of our banking structure is the one that was raised way back in the 1920s as a response to the stock market crash in the 20s and the late 20s, and that was the so-called Macmillan Report and the Macmillan Gap, as it became called, and he noted that there was not this close relationship in the UK between the banking sector and manufacturing industry, and a lot of explanations for that. But historically, there's a long history of that in this country, and it's still there today. Now, the solution that the Macmillan Committee came to was to set up a public bank, which was basically organised by the Bank of England and the clearing banks. It was set up by them, and that was very successful in the post-war period. And interestingly, it was copied by other countries, particularly Germany. They've got a very well-established public banking system, but it was left to kind of wither in the vine in the UK. And by I think the 80s, that bank had become basically a private bank, like the other banks. Mm. And the issue there is that it goes back to this idea of short-termism in the UK, that the banks, for example, in Germany, where you have got this kind of stakeholder model that I referred to earlier, where you have got this public banking system, there's a tendency there. Sorry, it's not a tendency; it's actually a well-established fact that the banks have a much longer-term relationship with their business clients. They know intimately what a firm is doing. Whether it's sustainable going forward, and therefore they're prepared to invest long term in that firm, and rather than just short term finance. And we know in the UK there's been certainly small to medium sized businesses have found it difficult to raise capital because they can't raise equity as large firms can, and so they do rely much more on the banking sector. So I think we need to rethink that going forward. I think that comes into the discussion we had earlier of stakeholder capitalism. So just to kind of round this discussion off, I'm not entirely sure that the digitalization of currencies is going to help that kind of theme. I remain to be convinced, because I'm not really an expert in blockchain and digital currencies and so on, but I would be somewhat skeptical that dimension of long-term investment would not really be helped by digitalization. I may well be wrong on that, but I do think you need the personal contacts. You need the physical presence of a bank in a remote location. For example, I live in the Highlands of Scotland. And so if there's a tendency to move, as there will be, to digital currencies, is that going to help a remote business, potentially a very successful business, which employs a lot of people, say, and therefore is useful in stemming population decline in this area? Is that business going to be helped by having if you like, a kind of virtual banking system? I doubt it, but as I say, I could be persuaded otherwise.
Yeah, I have very briefly a personal story. In fact, an admission of culpability here, in that earlier on in my career, when I worked for what is now HSBC, it was Midland Bank. It's that far back. Yeah. I helped lead a small team whose job it was to move lending decisions on the basis of new technology. That those were LAN networks in those days, from branches into area offices, and we know that was the beginning of that trend. And I distinctly remember thinking, "Really? Can you do that? Is that a good idea?" But it was above my pay grade, of course. Yeah. So that's my only excuse. But perhaps. I don't know what you think of this, but obviously, as you said, there's potentially huge efficiencies in terms of speed and cost, in terms of moving money around and knowing what's going on and the data that can come out of that. And I absolutely, get your point that, and I would say that we have to build that capability to support businesses and to finance them down the scale, down to micro businesses. We have to build that in. We have to, do that again. But perhaps, and maybe there's a ray of hope here. A lot of the branch networks has gone, but we're now in a Zoom world. Yes. We're now in a world where actually you can have this kind of interaction and build a a relationship without having to be there on the high street?
Yeah. Well, yes, exactly, and that's right. And but I suppose the counter to that is that we're getting a lot of evidence of the efficiency gains of Zoom and the application of that technology, and it's been absolutely brilliant, obviously, during the pandemic and being able to sustain businesses, people teleworking, working from home, and so on. But we're also getting a lot of evidence that, certainly in certain sectors, Zoom doesn't really unravel the nuances of human interactions, the eye contact, or basically someone's body language, for example. And obviously that won't be important in all sectors, but I think it may be important in what I was saying in terms of, well, you're trying to build these long-term relationships with businesses. Can you do that with Zoom? Maybe you can, but I have a question mark there. But as I say, I'm prepared to be convinced in that. Maybe you're right. Maybe Zoom will be the answer to the kind of problem I've raised, that we do need that close contact, and perhaps this is a more efficient way of doing it. And maybe that's how it will pan out. But I just wonder, really, yeah.
Yeah, I guess we're all still adjusting, and maybe the skill set will refine. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah.
There are other companies that make things like Zoom. Obviously, it wasn't intended as an advert necessarily, but final question, if I may. Sorry.
No, it may be that all the bots that we're getting from artificial intelligence, we may find that they're better able at reading people's body language than we humans are going forward. So maybe that will help as well to use this technology in the banking sector. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see a dashboard there with, whether you're telling the truth and so on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
anyway,
right.
It's been fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so much for this. The final question is, if there's one thing that you would like to leave with folks, with members of the audience from your report and what we've been talking about today, what would it be?
Well, I think the central theme is that we shouldn't return to the old normal. I don't think we ever will be able to. But I think policy should recognise that there should not be a return to the new normal the old normal, for all of the reasons we've been saying. And I think policymakers have to start thinking and supporting the trends we're seeing towards this new normal and what it should be. And central to that, I think, as I said, I'd like to see sustainable development being, one of the centerpieces of certainly economic policy going forward. So that would be my thought to leave with people, that we really should be thinking, we should be looking ahead to the new spring and to the new normal, and we have to take the best of the old normal, perhaps, but we have to recognize all the trends that are emerging, both in terms of technology and climate change, the potential for future pandemics, as we said, and so on, what this means for the new normal we should be creating.
And to borrow a phrase, this time it has to be different.
This time it has to be different, exactly, yeah, that's exactly right.
And I think my takeaway from this, and if I may, is that we do need this new economics. We need a new way of looking at things. And if I were able, I would invite yourself and Kate Rayworth and Mario Mazzucato and maybe one or two other people around for dinner. But maybe we can have a panel at some point and talk about that.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah, that would be good. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, Professor MacDonald. I really appreciate your time and your insights, and I hope people are listening. And I can't wait for the next report.
Well, thank you, and I've greatly enjoyed talking to you today. It's been very a lot of fun. Yeah.
Great. Thanks again. Bye for now.
Okay. Thank you.